Hey everybody, this is the preface and first chapter of Existential Marxism in Postwar France, from Sartre to Althusser, by Mark Poster. It's dedicated to Poster's father. The preface says, "My purpose in this study has been to trace the relationship of Marxism and existentialism as the dominant theme in recent French social thought. My thesis is that the two doctrines converge in Sartre and in the journal, and in the arguments group, establishing the beginnings of a social theory of the New Left. Starting from the period right after World War II and Marxism and existentialism were competing doctrines, I had described the movement of Sartre and his circle toward Marxism and the movement of Marxists away from Stalinism. By the mid-1960s, there had been various attempts at a synthetic existential Marxism, all of which should be seen as its tentative beginnings that might result in a major new social theory. In the final chapter, I test the new theory by using it to help us comprehend the events of May-June 1968. Existential Marxism emerges as a social theory suited to comprehend the conditions and the contradictions of advanced industrial society, to articulate the situation of various groups in the society, and to provide a new kind of theory for the human sciences, and sees the scientist not as value-free or objective, but as implicated in the object of his knowledge. Existential Marxism might thus be considered both as the, quote, ideology of an emerging radical coalition and as a theoretical advance in its own right. My disciplinary orientation is that of the history of ideas, which describes changing intellectual patterns with more concern for the relations of ideas to society than for the logical consistency of the ideas themselves. Hence, I have not attempted a systematic exposition of New Left social theory, but have restricted myself, with minor exceptions, to articulating the theories of the French. It will be clear to the reader that I am sympathetic to the effort of the existential Marxists, although I am not committed to any particular version of their thinking. I adhere to their commitment to a radical restructuring of relations and institutions in advanced industrial society, and I am especially convinced of the value of their efforts to redefine the nature of the human sciences. My study of their positions has challenged me to consider the limitations of intellectual history, but I have not deviated very far in this work from its traditional methodological boundaries. Finally, it is my hope that the study of the theoretical advances of the French will be of value to all those concerned about the present state of social theory in the human sciences, and to all those in the United States who are beginning to confront their situation on a theoretical level. I have been able to profit from the work of other scholars of recent French social theory, such as H.S. Hughes's book, The Obstructed Path, published in 1968, covers the period from 1930 to 1960, ranging over the entire landscape of social thought. Walter Odinick, Marxism and Existentialism of 1965, analyzes philosophically the relations of Stalinist Marxism and Sartre's early positions. George Lichtheim's book, Marxism in Modern France, published in 1966, illuminates Marxism at the level of political theory. Arnold Metzger, Existentialismus und Sozialismus, der Dialog des Zeitalters, published in 1968, interrogates the two doctrines by looking at the German traditions of Martin Heidegger and Lebensphilosophy. Raymond Aron's book, Marxism and Existentialism of 1969, treats the French scene, and I have dealt with his views as part of my narrative. It should be stated that my study treats the convergence of Marxism and existentialism as both possible and necessary, whereas previous accounts have been either suspicious or hostile. Hence, the study attempts to revise the current usage of this period of French social theory from one of an obstructed path to one that accounts for openings into new directions. Instead of characterizing the period through the impasses and dead ends of Camus, Teilhard de Chardin, and others, as does Hughes, we will see that it was a period of profound reorientation and vitality in social theory. For purposes of a provisional statement to help the reader orient himself as he proceeds, existential Marxism may be defined very loosely as follows: a non-Leninist Marxism that conceptualizes advanced industrial society in a way that points towards the possible elimination of its alienating structures, that looks to all the relations of daily life, not simply to relations of production, to make society intelligible, that picks up from existentialism the effort to capture human beings in the moment of their active creation of their world, in their subjectivity, and finally, that rejects the attempt to have a closed theory complete within itself. A fellowship from the University of California made it possible for me to visit Paris and speak with many French theorists. I want to note my thanks for their kind help in their putting up with my French, such as it is. I spoke with the following people: Costas Axelos, Jean Baudrillard, Bernard Besnier, Michel Antoine Bernier, Cornelius Castoriadis, Michel Cantat, Dominique Desanti, Jean-Marie Domanac, Joseph Gable, Richard Gombin, André Gortz, Claude Lefort, Edgar Morin, Stanley Poolberg, and Pierre Vidal-Naquet. I want to mention also the colleagues and friends who argued with me about this study, who read parts of the manuscript, and who have given me the criticisms and suggestions. Robert Anker, Paul Brenes. He wrote a book with Indra Rato on the young Lukacs that I'm currently reading. David Carnell, Peter Klesick, Jack Diggins, Alexander Gailey, Martin J., big historian of the Frankfurt School, Frederick Jameson, James Millar, David Schalk, Jeremy Shapiro, Richard Shiri Weber, and Hayden White. Hayden White being like, I think he's like a big guy in like applying kind of like postmodern concepts to history. I'm not sure. In particular, I want to thank Dick Howard. I think he wrote with what's his name? It's Howard, and what's the other guy's name? I don't know, it's eluding me right now, but I think he wrote like the big book on like the history of Marxist economics. In particular, I want to thank Dick Howard for the enormous help he has freely given to me in working over the manuscript. Also, Jacqueline Doyle worked tirelessly to put me in touch with materials beyond the limited sources of Orange County. Finally, my family lived with me the ups and downs of this study and received my thanks for their support and patience. And that's signed from Laguna Beach, California. The table of contents says, preface that we just read, part 1 of the book is titled Neither Idealism Nor Materialism. Chapter 1 is titled, or section 1 is titled The Hegel Renaissance. No, it's the chapter 1 is titled The Hegel Renaissance Towards a Philosophical Anthropology, with the headings Hegel in France, Kojeve, From Masters and Slaves to Free Workers. 3. Hyppolite, The Unhappy Consciousness. 4. Hegel, Marx, and Sartre. Chapter 2 is titled The Rediscovery of Marx and the Concept of Alienation, with the headings 1. Stalinism and the French Communist Party. 2. Lukacs and Goldmann. 3. The 1844 Manuscripts. 4. The Objections of the French. 5. Two Marxes or One. Chapter 3 is titled The Early Sartre, Existentialist Concept of Freedom, with Chapter 1, with the sections 1. The question of Sartre's radicalism. 2. Freedom to create oneself. 3. Bad faith, freedom in relation with oneself. 4. The situation. Part 2 of the book is titled Stalinism and the Existentialists, 1944 to 1956. Chapter 4 is titled The Attack on Sartre, 1944 to 1948, with the headings 1. The Attack Begins. 2. The Book Being in Nothingness Under Fire. 3. Sartre Responds. 4. Merleau-Ponty's Existential Marxism. Chapter 5 is titled Existentialist in Motion, 1950 to 1956, with the headings 1. Sartre Finds the Proletariat, 1950 to 1954. 2. Merleau-Ponty on Sartre's Dialectical Adventures. 3. Polemics with Pierre Neville. 4. The Hungarian Invasion, Skepticism or Stoicism. Section 5. The Confrontation with Liberalism. 6. Genet and the Other. 7. Socialisme ou Barbarie. Part 3 of the book is titled Towards an Existential Marxism, 1957 to 1968. Chapter 6 is titled The Argument Group, Existentialized Marxist, with the headings 1. Argument. 2. Marine Mascolo and the CP, the Communist Party. 3. Beyond Philosophy. 4. Costas Axelos and the Concept of Play. 5. Fugirola's Heideggerian Marxism. 6. Chatelet's Concept of Satisfaction. Lefebvre's Concept of Everyday Life. 8. The Question of Freud. Chapter 7 is titled Sartre's Critique, Marxian Existentialism. 1. The conversion to Marxism. 2. The dialectic and its limit. 3. Praxis and nature. 4. Groups and freedom. 5. Toward a social ontology. 6. From the critique to Flaubert. Chapter 8 is titled Existential Marxism and Structuralism, with the headings 1. Sartre and Structuralism. 2. Althusser's Revolution Without Rebels. Chapter 9 is titled Epilogue, Intellectuals in May 1968, with the headings 1. Post-industrial society and the new working class. 2. From the spectacle to the festival. 3. Sartre and Lefebvre explain history. And Chapter 1, or Part 1, is titled, that we're just going to start reading now, Neither Idealism nor Materialism. Chapter 1 is titled The Hegel Renaissance Toward a Philosophical Anthropology. Section 1. Hegel in France. A sudden prominence of Hegel among French intellectuals after World War II signified a break with traditions of thought. French intellectuals had paid little attention to Hegel when he dominated German thought in the 1830s and 1840s. Even a thinker like Auguste Comte, with his grand vision of the total development of mankind that in many ways paralleled Hegel's, remained ignorant of his counterpart in the East. Footnote. See Frank Manuel's book, Prophets of Paris, 1965. And footnote. The utter absence of interest in Hegel by academic philosophers as well as by intellectuals was reported as late as 1931 by Alexandre Courret, a historian of philosophy and of science. Unlike Germany, England, and Italy, France had no Hegelian schools, but one recognized disciple of Hegel. Not one recognized disciple of Hegel, and of course few serious students of Hegel in French universities. Only, quote, offbeat intellectuals like André Breton's surrealists and a circle of young Marxists in the 1920s paid tribute to the German dialectician. Among the reasons suggested by Courret for the lack of interest in Hegel was the obscurity of Hegel's writing, the strength of Cartesian and Kantian philosophical traditions, Hegel's Protestantism, but above all the incredulity of the French toward Hegel's, quote, strict identity of logical synthesis and historical becoming, end quote. And that quotation is from Leon Brunschwig. On the contrary, for French rationalists, history was separate from reason or logic, which was eternal outside time. If this was the situation, how can we account for the abrupt turn to Hegel in the 1940s? In the eyes of many converts to Hegel, the catastrophic defeat of France in 1940 had discredited liberal bourgeois intellectual and political traditions, leaving the nation in a conceptual vacuum. The only moral force left in France on the eve of the liberation came from the resistance movement, which had been dominated by politically progressive groups. In the estimate of Henri Lefebvre, quote, after the liberation, there was no longer ... bourgeois thought calling itself such, end quote. Henri Lefebvre. 1957. The experience of the war and the resistance, quote, transformed the basic givens of intellectual life in France, the themes of reflection, the problems, concepts, and attitudes, end quote. Lefebvre, 1957. After 1944, there was a longing for basic renewal, social, political, and intellectual. With a combined socialist and communist vote reaching a majority, intellectuals harbored the dream of imminent and radical social transformation. During the hopeful but finally disillusioning post-war years, the, quote, decisive philosophical event, end quote, was the discovery of the Hegelian dialectic. There were thus direct links between the collapse of the old bourgeois world, the expectations of socialism, and the emergence of interest in Hegel. The rebirth of interest in Hegel is directed primarily at the book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, and to a somewhat lesser degree at Hegel's early essays. Intellectuals of most traditions, Catholics, Marxist, existentialist, phenomenologists, and academic philosophers read and debated Hegel, immersing themselves in a system of thought that was foreign to established assumptions. The assimilation of the phenomenology of spirit was particularly the point of departure for the confrontation of Marxism and existentialism. The reading of Hegel, it was felt, could dissolve the long-standing conflict between idealist and materialist and could initiate a totally fresh direction of investigation. The study of the introduction of Hegel into France forms a prologue to the eventual formation of a new intellectual synthesis. The task of bringing the book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, to a broad audience, of demonstrating the power and insight of this book, fell to two men, Alexandre Kojeve, a Russian émigré, and Jean Hyppolite. By themselves, these two philosophers translated Hegel, lectured on Hegel, and published lengthy commentaries on the phenomenology of spirit, bringing to light and confronting the public with a new way of thinking and of seeing the world. Many important developments in French thought since then derived directly or indirectly from the unsettling and reshuffling of French consciousness inspired by the Hegel Renaissance. The study of the phenomenology of spirit by Kojeve and Hyppolite was an intellectual source for the renewal of Marxism, for Sartre's existentialism, and perhaps even for the structuralism of the 1960s. The profound effect of the phenomenology resounded in varied tones in diverse corners of French intellectual life. Yet everyone agreed that Hegel, although himself an idealist, provided a means of criticizing certain aspects of idealism. The idealist tendency to make concepts atemporal was the chief defect for which the French found an antidote in Hegel. In the phenomenology of spirit's emphasis on the historicity of reason, and conversely the rationality of history, was the source of its relevance. Now Catholics could escape Thomism, Marxists oppose Stalinism, and existentialists combat neo-Kantianism. I'm not sure, I don't want to say this because I'm not sure if this is actually true, but I feel like I've heard that Kojeve was like a Stalinist agent, or maybe it was Hyppolite, I'm not sure, but I think it was Kojeve. I'm not sure about that, so don't quote me on it, but do your own research on it if you're interested in that possibility. The arid forms of rationalism in academic philosophy appeared feeble compared with Hegel's philosophy of alienation in history, his dialectic, his phenomenology of consciousness. Perhaps Hegel held the key to unlock the riddles of the dualisms of subject and object, of what is and what ought to be, of history and ontology, of the individual and society, of science and humanism, of knowledge and action. Such, for example, was the sanguine attitude of Merleau-Ponty. Quote, all the great philosophical ideas of the past century had their beginnings in Hegel. The philosophies of Marx and Nietzsche, phenomenology, German existentialism, and psychoanalysis. It was he who started the attempt to explore the irrational and integrate it into an expanded reason, which remains the task of our century. End quote. And that's from the book, from Merleau-Ponty's book, Sense and Nonsense. Footnote. Throughout this study, translations are my own except where the title is given in English. Also, all emphases are in the original except where otherwise indicated. And footnote. Hegel's phenomenology also used to combat recent conservatism of European social thought in the first 3 decades of the century. The scientific study of society seemed to demonstrate that it was in the nature of things, that democracy was an unattainable ideal, that social order requires elites, coercive organizations, and irrational ideologies. Social theory in the hands of Durkheim, Pareto, Weber, and Michel had uncovered irrationalities in modern society that tended to dim all hopes of radical democratization. Footnote. See H. Stuart Hughes' book, Consciousness and Society, The Reorientation of European Social Thought, 1890 to 1930. Pareto drew attention to the force of irrational emotions in political affairs and to the inexorable, quote, circulation of elites, end quote, which did not affect the strength of oppressive authority. Durkheim concluded that anomie, or moral disorientation, was the result of the influence of corrosive rationalism, the division of labor, and the demise of traditional village communities. Weber gloomily prophesied a spiritless, routinized, disenchanted world, emerging paradoxically from the, quote, rationalization of social institutions and social action. Footnote, see Herbert Marcuse's Negations, Essays in Critical Theory for a penetrating critique of Max Weber's category of rationalization, arriving at similar conclusions. End footnote. These social theorists divorce science from the practice of overcoming the ills they uncovered. For them, history was irrational. Social conflicts could not be settled through rational discussion since men acted blindly or irrationally. French intellectuals saw in Hegel an answer to the conservatism of these ideas. Marxists and existentialists read the phenomenology of spirit as a critique of the notion that reason and history were antithetical. The error of the social scientists lay in their methodology and theory of knowledge. Their idealism situated the knower outside the field of knowledge, outside history. Merleau-Ponty complained that, quote, Durkheim treats the social as a reality external to the individual and entrusts it with explaining everything that is presented to the individual as what he has to become, end quote. Sense and nonsense. Merleau-Ponty. This way of seeing society as something outside the individual was common to Weber and Pareto as well. It fails to comprehend the individual from a network of interpenetrating interactions and ends in privileging the individual on the one hand and justifying social coercion on the other. Distant from the field of historical action, hidden behind the screen of reason, the social theorist could not fail to find the irrational in history and reason beyond it. As the French read him, Hegel taught that if reason or the theorists were seen within history, the object of his study would not be a remote, quote, irrational other, but would become interiorized and reveal its deeper rationality. The fact of hierarchies and irrational norms, from the Hegelian perspective, would appear as historical distortions within the possibility of human perfectibility, not as immutable. Institutions and ideas that resulted from unforeseen, unintended social action would appear open to reason and to change. Contradictions in the field of social reality would appear in their proper interrelatedness, not in dissociated opposition. Hegel insisted on the connection of each particular to the totality, on the interdependence of apparently distinct fields of social experience. What was contradictory to idealist rationality became intelligible to the historical dialectic of Hegel's reason. This theme was prominent in the controversial reading of Hegel by Kojeve. Section 2. Kojeve, From Masters and Slaves to Free Workers. Alexandre Kojeve, recently a high official in the common market, established a small but very distinguished Hegel cult at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, where Kojeve lectured on the phenomenology of spirit from 1933 to 1939. Some of the luminaries of French intellectual life regularly attended Kojeve's classes on Hegel. Raymond Aron, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, R.P. Fessard, Raymond Queneau, Jean de Sainty, Georges Bataille, and Jacques Lacan, leading liberals, existentialists, Catholics, novelists, communists, surrealists, and structuralists, eagerly initiated themselves into the new mode of thought. It was even said that Jean-Paul Sartre himself was enrolled, although his attendance at the classes was not recalled. Some literary wits, especially Cold War liberals and Communist Party Marxists, were quick to satirize the force and influence of Kojeve's lectures on his students. For example, Jean de Sainty, who later, quote, matured to Stalinist ideology, sought to erase from his past his interest in Kojeve's Hegel. Quote, we were at that time, 1936, young communist students. For many of us, Marxism remained somewhat external and undigested. Certainly we read Marx and Engels, but we went toward them as towards masters of the past, keeping our distance intellectually in relation to their work, ... This is why, at the same time that I was repelled by the lectures of Alexandre Kojeve, who stifled my old rationalist education, I found myself also disquieted and attracted. Finding a new mystery in reason, I broke the, quote, theological and, quote, authority it had until then in my eyes. It seemed to me that viewing reason in the new way made it more human. And since I was under the influence of Leon Brunswick, I don't know how to say that name, debating the interior difficulties of Kantianism, I did not delay in gradually moving toward the, quote, philosophies of existence and, quote, thinking to escape through them both the aridity and the contradictions of, quote, vulgar rationalism, end quote. Jean de Sainty. Although Jean de Sainty did not accept Kojeve's version of Hegel, Jean de Sainty acknowledged that the lectures did help him in overcoming the, quote, official philosophy of Kantian rationalism. Still more critical of Kojeve was the liberal Aimé Patry. In his eyes, this Hegel craze was only too successful in promoting a vague and unsalutary Teutonic radicalism. I don't know how you say that word, Teutonic, as in like German. I don't know. I feel like if it was said in German, you'd say the E and the U as oi, as you say like when something's new, noi. Anyway, quote, Kojeve is the unknown superior whose dogma is revered, often unawares, by that important subdivision of the, quote, animal kingdom of the spirit, end quote, in the contemporary world, the progressivist intellectuals. In the years preceding the Second World War in France, the transition was effected by means of oral initiation to a group of persons who, in turn, took the responsibility for instructing others, and so on. From that time on, we breathe Kojeve's teaching with the air of the times, end quote. And that quote is from I'm not sure. But it says that quote, I can't tell if that's from Kojeve or if it's from de Sainty or if it's from this Aimé Patry. I feel like it might be de Sainty. Oh no, Aimé Patry is probably who it is. And that quote is from, that quote was cited by Alan Bloom in his introduction to the book, Introduction to the Reading of Hegel by Alexandre Kojeve, translated in 1969. Anyway, Kojeve's class on Hegel might have remained an interesting but obscure moment in French intellectual history, except for the publication in 1947 of the student notebook, collected and edited by Raymond Queneau. The notebooks appear together with an article by Kojeve on the master-slave relation, as well as some of his own lecture notes under the title Introduction à la lecture de Hegel, Leçons sur la phénoménologie de l'esprit. The book went through multiple editions and appeared in English in the abridged form in 1969. For Kojeve, Hegel's book, Phenomenology of Spirit, was the answer to liberal bourgeois metaphysics and politics. The question, quote, who is man? Quote, how did man become social? Quote, what are the possibility of man's development within society? And quote, were answered by Hegel in a revolutionary way. Liberal bourgeois thought, from Locke to John Stuart Mill, established the nature of man abstractly by comprehending man outside and before society. In the liberal tradition, an ahistorical static human species rationally calculates its advantages in perfect bourgeois fashion and constitutes society out of its harmonious consensus. Distorting history into a self-justifying mythology of bourgeois society, the liberal erases the complex development of humanity, leaving only its bourgeois form, and projects it onto the past. The rational bourgeois emerges like Minerva, fully mature, and all other shapes and forms of humanity are eliminated. Only the bourgeois, single-mindedly bent on preserving himself by preserving and aggrandizing his property, is truly human. In Kojeve's reading of Hegel, the concepts of liberalism were adamantly denied, and the basis for Marx's concept of class struggle was laid. The book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, in Kojeve's hands, centered on a philosophical anthropology, on the self-development of man, on his self-recognition, and on his historical and temporal nature. All this is founded in the dialectic of the master and the slave. The first, quote, moment of human reality, man's first structure of consciousness, is mere contemplation, simple awareness of the object, the outward thrust of consciousness toward the thing, toward exteriority, without self-consciousness. This structure of consciousness includes sensation, perception, and primitive consciousness. The human subject is as yet not constituted. Passive contemplation was insufficient for Hegel to constitute self-consciousness. Only desire, the awareness of a lack within the subject, compelled man to the recognition of his own reality, hurtling him into the drama of history, the story of the humanization of man and nature. Desire had first to become not desire of an object, but desire of desire. In other words, desire for the recognition of specifically human reality. In short, for human desire to emerge, the individual had need of another individual to recognize his desire and give it homage as human reality. Thus, the momentous act that constituted man as a human species required an interaction among men. Quote, real and true man is the result of his interaction with others, end quote. Kojeve. Man is thus social and also historical from the beginning. The recognition of human desire was impossible without a struggle to the death between men. In order for men to recognize each other's humanity, they have to be willing to risk the loss of their physical lives. Only when men struggled among themselves for prestige, not for self-preservation and not for property, was the desire to be human recognized as such. Hence, the first interactions among men were wars of prestige. Hegel had here interlinked in one unified moment the birth of man with that of history and society. Throughout the phenomenology, man, history, and society were bound up with each other. Thus, there was no abstract individual here, no isolated Robinson Crusoe through whom the specific attributes of the bourgeoisie could be projected and sanctified as the eternal nature of man. To Kojeve, Hegel ended once and for all the mistake of regarding one's own tribe, one's own nation, one's own class as the image of all mankind. Yet there was a certain danger of glorifying violence in Kojeve's account of the struggle to the death. Kojeve came close in places to ontologizing this moment of the phenomenology of spirit and veering toward fascism. The implications of the master-slave conflict are still greater. The struggle to the death for prestige could not, paradoxically, really end in death. Death would simply end the relation of recognition, and man would slide regressively back into animality. God, I love that word. Sorry, 1 second. The struggle had to be consummated by the establishment of permanent relations between combatants. The victor became the master or the autonomous consciousness, and the vanquished, the one who refused to risk himself in the struggle, became the slave or dependent consciousness. A human society was constituted of masters and slaves, of aristocrats and peasant serfs, of rulers and ruled. This was a harsh society with no trace of the fairy tale of a felicitous and consensual social contract. But again, human development was not left petrified in a hierarchical society, since history continued to unfold dialectically. Relationships between masters and slaves are internal bonds in which the consciousness of each is shaped by the other. The master and the slave were not social atoms, the one being, quote, better off, and in a position of dominance, the other, quote, worse off and dependent. In any relationship involving domination, the humanity of both the ruler and the ruled has been mutilated and distorted. The master was actually dependent on the slave for his status as master, both in the general society and in the eyes of the slave. The master was recognized as such only because he controlled slaves. What is worse, the master could not achieve the recognition he originally fought for in this relationship because he was recognized only by a slave, by someone he regards as subhuman. In Kojeve's words, the master was in a, quote, existential impasse, end quote. He needed an autonomous person to recognize his desire as human, but instead of free recognition, he received only the servile dependent recognition of the slave. The irony in Hegel's dialectic of master and slave comes from his insight that it was the slave who moves humanity toward a higher level of self-realization, a notion to which Marx was deeply indebted in developing his concept of the proletariat as the emancipator of mankind. In the society of masters and slaves, the master is locked into a position in which his humanity can neither be recognized nor satisfied. The slave is not satisfied with his position either, being oppressed and exploited by the master. Unlike the master, however, the slave receives no prestige from his lot and is ready for, quote, change, transcendence, transformation, and education, end quote. The slave is the secret change in history, and his desire for freedom from oppression is the ground of man's becoming more human. Quote, the complete, absolutely free man, definitely and completely satisfied by what he is, the man who is perfected and completed in and by this satisfaction, will be the slave who has, quote, overcome his slavery. If idle mastery is an impasse, laborious slavery, in contrast, is the source of all human social historical progress. History is the history of the working slave. That's actually very poetic. I don't know if I agree with it or not, but I think that's a good quote. Yeah, that quote's from Kojeve. I don't know if I said that already. Undoubtedly, Kojeve has here colored Hegel with his own Marxism, making him more the advocate of the working class than he might have liked. But Kojeve has done no more than elaborate the concept of the slave that Marx himself found clearly enough in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. In the total terror of the master's rule, the slave discovers his humanity as something denied and rejected. In his desire to overcome this lack, he has to undergo a process of self-transformation that prepares him for freedom. And the key to the education of the slave is work. Sorry, I had to copy that down. The slave produced and the master consumed. The slave labored without gratification, and the master's slightest whim was fulfilled without effort. The slave was compelled to delay and to sublimate his desires. The worker thus became civilized or bourgeois, learning to control and direct his desires, and in the process achieving control over nature. Subjectively, the working slave learned to marshal and concentrate his energies towards ends that he himself defined, while objectively he created products that confirmed his internal aims and submitted nature to his control. Kojeve's commentary reads, quote, the working consciousness thereby attains a contemplation of autonomous given being, such that it contemplates itself in it. The product of work is the worker's production. It is the realization of his project, of his idea, It is by work and only by work that man realizes himself objectively as man, It is only by work that man is a supernatural being, that is conscious of its reality. By working, he is, quote, incarnated spirit. He is historical, quote, world. He is, quote, objectivized, and, quote, history, end quote. Kojeve did not, however, account for the uniqueness of the proletariat, in the Marxist sense, in his notion of the master-slave relation. In the history of European thought, Hegel's concept of work was an important turning point, one that Marx would develop further. Aristocratic Greek philosophy, most notably in Aristotle, had denigrated work as an activity worthy only of unfree men. Generally speaking, the Christian churches, although attributing some value to human labor, placed work in the context of the fallen world as man's harsh penance for original sin. It seems like, just as a side note from me, I don't know if I'm reading this correctly, but this seems like very much like a celebration of work, like a very like it seems like a very bourgeois interpretation of work. I don't know how much of a turning point this necessarily is, because it seems like one of the whole premises of like the bourgeois civilization is this veneration of work and taking it, different degrees of extremity depending on time and place. But it seems very much so that like that was like a kind of a very much a thing of like the bourgeois era. But that just seems like a side note for me. Anyway, later Calvin's Reformed Church looked to success in work for signs of grace without allowing it an intrinsic value. I don't know. I'm not an expert in Calvin, but that just seems somewhat dubious to me. I don't know. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the ascetic spirit of liberalism contrasted laboring humanity favor with an idle, parasitic nobility. The chief see, that's what I'm talking about right there. Okay. The chief exponent of economic liberalism, Adam Smith, whom Hegel read, found in work the key to the well-being of nations. Work became a moral good for many enlightened intellectuals. Still, for the radical wing of the philosophes, the revaluation of work derived most of its derived from work's instrumental external results, not from the process itself. Work was rational activity that benefited society, controlled nature, and brought prosperity to the individual. Hegel took the liberal notion further by investing work with the central quality of man's development, a free consciousness, not in the accumulation of money, not in technical discoveries that brought, quote, progress, but in the creation of an object was the essence of man, his self-determination expressed and objectively realized. Work overcame the slave's fear, confronting the slave with a world that was open to his reason, giving him confidence in his capacity for freedom, in his ability to realize his powers of thought. In Kojeve's words, quote, man achieves his true autonomy, his authentic freedom, only after passing through slavery, after surmounting the fear of death by work performed in the service of another, unquote. In sum, Kojeve taught his French students in the 1930s that Hegel had developed a revolutionary social theory in which the working class played a central role in the Aufhebung, the dialectical overcoming of authoritarian society into free society, and the workers were the, quote, absolute negation, unquote, of the world of the masters. Footnote. The influence of Kojeve was so widespread in all fields of human studies that it is pointless to make specific references. Nevertheless, here is an example from a Sartrean literary historian, Serge Dubrovsky, in the book Connaught et la dialectique du héros, or héros. Quote, and this is from 1963, quote, Hegel, for the first time in the history of philosophy, had made a systematic study of relation with the other and given it a fundamental importance, end quote. Dubrovsky. See also page 502 of that work for Dubrovsky's attempt to use the dialectic of the master and the slave to analyze Connaught's heroes. End footnote. Maybe you know what that is. I do not. At the same time, Kojeve subsumed the separate stages of consciousness of the phenomenology of spirit under the master-slave relationship. The dialectic of man's self-transformation was tinted throughout Kojeve's account by the subjective process of recognition. Each moment of becoming did not stand equal to the others, but was seen essentially as a further development of the further development of the struggle for recognition. I said bracket because it's like there's like markings in this PDF. In this way, Kojeve was able to put in relief those aspects of Hegel's thought that led to Marxism and existentialism. We have already noted that the struggle for recognition was a source for Marx's concept of the historical role of the proletariat. Similarly, the Kierkegaardian sense of the subjectivity was highlighted in Kojeve's account of the master-slave relation. In addition, Kojeve was able to assert that Heidegger's concept of man as a being in the world was also fundamental to the phenomenology of spirit. Kojeve's theme of the struggle for recognition also suited the anti-metaphysical tendency of French Marxists and Existentialists. Both Marxists and Existentialists could learn from Kojeve's reading of Hegel that it was not necessary to posit, at the beginning of thought, a concept that captured the full presence of being because reality unfolded in time. The process of man's becoming was identified with a dialectic moving from the finite of the given to the infinite of possibility and back from infinite to a new finitude. In each epoch of history, all views were partial and incomplete. Hence, time was an open unfolding of possibilities in which each moment was both absolute and relative. Absolute in relation to itself and in relation to... In each epoch of history, all views were partial and incomplete. Hence, time was an open unfolding of possibilities in which each moment was both absolute and relative, absolute in relation to itself and relative in relation to the past and the future. Since Aristotelian, Cartesian, and Kantian notions of a static absolute were discarded, the problems of freedom and determinism, knowledge and being, essence and existence were all placed on a new footing. What is more, the nature and significance of history shifted from the sphere of accident and relativity to one of reason. For Kojeve, the historical dialectic enabled Hegel to have true self-comprehension. Quote, Hegel was the only one to understand himself as this whole, to give a correct and complete answer to the Cartesian question, what am I? By understanding himself through the understanding of the totality of the anthropogenetic historical process, which ends with Napoleon and his contemporaries, and by understanding this process through his understanding of himself, Hegel calls the completed whole of the universal real process to penetrate into his individual consciousness, and then he penetrated this consciousness. Thus, this consciousness became just as total as universal as the process that it revealed by understanding itself, and this fully self-conscious consciousness is absolute knowledge, end quote. Kojeve. One of the implications of Kojeve's theme of recognition, which was very influential in the development of existential Marxism, was that Hegel's phenomenology established a new philosophical anthropology. Hegel demonstrated that reason was not an eternal archetype, but a changing structure of consciousness, which was constituted through man's positing himself in the world and then comprehending that position. The difficulty of this argument raised by Marxists and later by structuralists was that to the degree that man's self-awareness was distorted throughout most of history, the structures of his reality, and indeed of reality itself, could not be fixed through a study of human consciousness. At any point in time, one should look instead at the exterior structures of nature or society to find, quote, man more radically. There was no such center of reality, properly speaking, as man's self or consciousness. To Kojeve, Hegel was able to escape these apparently anti-humanist conclusions by minimizing the significance of nature or external reality. Thus, Hegel's philosophical anthropology, as presented by Kojeve, remained in question throughout the post-war years. What is more, Kojeve's discussion of other sections of the phenomenology of spirit contained tendencies more compatible with Heideggerian irrationalism than with Marx and Sartre. Section 3. Hyppolite, the unhappy consciousness. The unhappy consciousness. Let me just make sure I'm pronouncing that name right. I'm feeling self-conscious now. Hyppolite. Okay, Hyppolite. Okay. not Hyppolite. Hyppolite. Anyway, section 3, Hyppolite, the unhappy consciousness. Perhaps even more than to Kojeve, credit for the task of bringing Hegel to the French public should go to Jean Hyppolite, a professor at the Sorbonne and then at the Collège de France. Hyppolite began writing articles on Hegel in the late 1930s after teaching himself German by studying the Phenomenology. He then published the first complete translation of the all-important Phenomenology of Spirit between 1939 and 1941, which has become the standard text in France. After World War II, Hyppolite continued to publish important commentaries on Hegel, beginning in 1947 with the Jeunesse et structure de la phénoménologie de l'esprit de Hegel. This work appeared simultaneously with Kojeve's Introduction and was quickly established as a major study. In 1948, he published the short Introduction à la philosophie de la Histoire or Histoire de Hegel. In 1952, Logique et Existence, Essai sur la logique de Hegel. And finally, in 1955, Études sur Marx et Hegel, a collection of articles. These books all went through multiple editions. In addition, Hyppolite taught Hegel to many of the thinkers who began to dominate French intellectual life in the late 1960s, among them Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Louis Althusser, and Jacques Derrida. Bearing all this in mind, one must conclude that Hyppolite's interpretation of Hegel was a major influence on the Hegel Renaissance. Within the corpus of Hegel's work, Hyppolite directed his students to the phenomenology of spirit, not only in his translation and commentary, but even in his work on Hegel's logic. Subtitled, quote, An Essay on Hegel's Logic, end quote, the book Logique et Existence struck French readers as simply a further discussion of the phenomenology rather than as an explication of Hegel's science of logic. Hyppolite taught the French to look to the phenomenology with its magisterial unfolding of the historical shapes of human consciousness for the secret of a new philosophical anthropology. Footnote. Hyppolite ultimately denies that Hegel put forth a new anthropology, but earlier he was ambivalent on this point. First, he stressed that the subject of the phenomenology of spirit was, quote, conscience de soi, or de soi, unquote, not man, a somewhat sophistic distinction. Hegel's followers could legitimately differ on emphasizing man, as Feuerbach and Marx did, or the absolute. What was history the history of self-consciousness, or was it the history of the absolute? Hyppolite leaned toward the latter interpretation, but acknowledged an ambiguity in Hegel. End footnote. New section, Section A, Self-Discovery and History. In a small book on the social and historical thought of Hegel, Hyppolite disclosed the motive for the sudden surge of interest in Hegel among the French. Quote, for the French, Hegel's vision of the world, is indispensable to know. According to Hegel, history and reason interpenetrate one another. The absolute, without the forms it takes necessarily in history, would be, quote, solitude without life, end quote. And it is with history that we must reconcile ourselves. Freedom is precisely this reconciliation. Hegelian freedom, we have insisted here, transcends the individual and the individual's private life. It is a reconciliation of man with his destiny, and history is the expression of this destiny. Our philosophers have thought about freedom in an entirely different way. From Descartes to Bergson, our philosophy is a refusal of history. Rather, it is dualist, looking for freedom in a reflection of the subject on himself. Hyppolite. In other words, the French philosophical tradition is in large part located at the center of the self in autonomous reflection, outside society, outside history, outside one's daily experience. Now, after the war had overturned the certainties of daily life, French intellectuals were compelled to seek a philosophy that related an intimate experience of the self to external worldly phenomena. Speaking about her situation in 1945, Simone de Beauvoir turned to Hegel as Hyppolite argued, quote, we had discovered the reality and weight of history. Now we were wondering about its meaning. Quenu, that's Queneau, it's a person, I guess, who had been initiated into Hegelianism by Kojeve, thought that one day all individuals would be reconciled in the triumphant unity of spirit. Unquote. Simone de Beauvoir. The French reading of Hegel demanded a total sharp break with the weakened tradition of Cartesian rationalism. Only within the purity of reason could the Cartesians spin out, in analytic succession, clear and distinct ideas. But the war had opened the inner sanctum of consciousness to the opacity and density of the outer world. The turn toward Hegel was one of the paths that the French took to break with their past. Unlike Kojeve's lectures, Hyppolite's commentary on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit attempted to render the meaning of the text with as little intrusion of the author as possible. Sorry, one second. Sorry about that. Unlike Kojeve's lectures, Hyppolite's commentary on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit attempted to render the meaning of the text with as little intrusion of the author as possible. Retaining his personal preferences, Hyppolite slowly and methodically traced the dialectic of consciousness from simple awareness of the object to absolute knowledge, leaving unresolved difficulties where the text was unclear, hesitating to force the part into a whole based on some favorite thesis. Hyppolite's reading of Hegel became the text for a whole generation of intellectuals who were satisfied to find in it more of Hegel than of Hyppolite. Nevertheless, the meaning of the phenomenology as a whole had to be clarified at the outset. In Hyppolite's rendering, the phenomenology of spirit was not to be taken as a world history, but as Hegel's, quote, voyage of discovery, end quote. Similar in function to Descartes' discourse on method, it revealed how Hegel formed his thought. Footnote. Hyppolite was at times ambiguous and contradictory on this point. At one point he referred to the phenomenology of spirit as, quote, the true concrete history of human consciousness, end quote. End footnote. End footnote. The different stages of consciousness described by Hegel did not fit into any pattern of world history. Rather, they made intelligible to Hegel his own spiritual development. The movement of consciousness, for example, from the master-slave relation to Stoicism, skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness, was intelligible in the first instance in terms of Hegel's own education, or Bildung. The phenomenology of spirit to Hyppolite resembled closely Rousseau's book on education, Emile, in which the individual proceeds through stages towards the complete development of his capacities. Although the phenomenology of spirit proceeded according to the inner necessity of Hegel's personal growth, Hyppolite's Hegel did not view his own development as completely unique, but as part of the development of humanity. Hegel's self-comprehension was at the same time self-comprehension of the age. He could only comprehend himself as part of his age, as part of the era of the French Revolution and Napoleon. Hence, history entered into the phenomenology as a necessary aspect of the individual's inner self-knowledge. History and reason were not opposites but mutually dependent. For this reason, Hegel began not as Descartes did, with a statement of the self-evident certain absolute truth, but with recounting for himself and for his time all forms of consciousness that were deeply distorted, quote, erroneous, uncertain, and relative. In Hyppolite's formulation, quote, Hegel tried to overcome the subject-object dualism of Kant by beginning not with absolute knowledge but with the phenomenal natural consciousness, end quote. Hyppolite. The beginning and the end of reflection was for Hegel the process of self-discovery through the history of consciousness. In addition, Hegel introduced history into the phenomenology of spirit through continuous allusions to previous philosophies and world outlooks. The stages of consciousness were labeled with the names of past philosophies like Stoicism and Skepticism, and references were made more or less overtly to Diderot's Remus's nephew and Kant's moral philosophy, Schiller's aesthetics, among others. This practice, Hyppolite argued, misled readers into finding a direct parallel between the stages of consciousness and history when they were logical more than historical. The historical references were necessary for Hegel because the process of the individual's self-discovery had to recount previous efforts. Quote, the primary intention of the phenomenology of spirit, as revealed in the introduction, is the rise of empirical consciousness to absolute knowledge, ... But this raising of empirical consciousness to absolute knowledge is only possible if one discovers in it the necessary stages of its ascension. These stages are still in it, and it is necessary only to descend into the interiority of memory by an operation like the Platonic reminiscence. The individual, in effect, child of his time, possesses in himself the entire substance of the spirit of his time. He needs only appropriate it, render it present again, end quote. Hyppolite. Yet Hyppolite left a residual ambiguity in his account. If there was not a purely historical succession of forms of consciousness, then each must be possible at any given time. Skepticism, for example, would be more than a Hellenistic form of consciousness. In that case, Hegel's concrete dialectic, in which each stage followed from its predecessor, was inadequate. New section. Section B. From substance to subject. If the phenomenology of spirit was not a world history, there was still a specific meaning in the movement of consciousness from sense certainty to absolute knowledge. Hyppolite understood this as the change from, quote, substance to subject, end quote, in Hegel's famous phrase. Reality and man were first conceived as, quote, thing, as substance, as in itself. Human consciousness understood both itself and the world as a series of fixed, hypostasized qualities. Without self-reflection, humanity recognized itself only as a thing among things. Spirit was substance. The difficult, tragic story of mankind narrated the gradual, quote, humanization of the in itself, end quote. Hegel's, quote, philosophy is a philosophy that conceives substance as subject, being as self, ... Its being is the movement by which it poses itself as other than itself in order to become itself, end quote. Hyppolite. The dialectic is the law of the movement from substance to subject. The change from one level or structure of consciousness to another is not a flat external juxtaposition of two different things. The dialectic does not resemble an external succession of qualities or styles, say Renaissance, Baroque, Classic, Romantic. It is an internal series of self-transformations. The dialectic captures human reality as moments of its development. Quote, ... One of the most profound traits of Hegelian speculation, was, to introduce life and becoming into thought itself, ... To make mobile the determinations of thought, that is, to think dialectically, end quote. Hyppolite. In Hyppolite's reading, the most dangerous problem for man was that he had to become an object of his own knowledge in order to be himself. Man had to pose himself, to externalize himself, to separate himself from himself, to negate himself, to alienate himself in order to first know himself and then to become himself. To become conscious of his own reality, man had to see himself as other, and this is possible only in a community. Quote, it is human history, the community of self-consciousness in their mutual relations, which confers on action its consistency and its reality, end quote. Hyppolite. Only by becoming, quote, for another could man become, quote, for himself. The individual needed to deny the given immediacy of his consciousness, negate it, throw himself into the world of natural things and other men in order to return to himself with self-knowledge. The apparently straightforward project of being oneself required a long series of detours and negations through which human reality finally constitutes itself. With Hegel's concept of the dialectic, the French were compelled to recognize that the intimate, private structures of the self were a shared communal reality. The clearest example of the dramatic challenge that the reading of Hegel posed to the French stemmed from the denial of solipsistic individualism in the phenomenology of spirit. Bourgeois thought normally teetered on the edge of solipsism, defining the center of the self as an individualist cognitive capacity in which relations with other people were always secondary. As in competitive market relations, the thought and even the existence of the other person was always problematical. One could never be sure of what the other person thought, felt, or experienced. The stable foundations of reality were therefore locked up in the consciousness of isolated individuals. To Hegel, however, regardless of whether one attained intimate certainty of the other's mind or not, the other was needed for the constitution of the self. Hyppolite explained it this way, quote, "Just as the life of an individuality can only be fulfilled by finding itself in another individuality, so the desire that constitutes the self can only exist if it is for itself an object of another desire. Thus the desire of life becomes the desire of another desire, or rather, in view of the necessary reciprocity of the phenomenon, human desire is always desire of the desire of another. Desire of the desire of another. Thus, in human love, desire appears to the self as the desire of the desire of another. The self needs to be beheld by the other." End quote. Hyppolite. I just wanted to copy that down. The final emergence of man as subject did not, however, cancel out all tension from human existence, since the fundamental structure of consciousness included the moment of alienation. Hyppolite translated Hegel's Entfremdung as Extranation, or alienation, defining it as, quote, "the strangeness of the objectification," end quote. Because self-consciousness always required self-objectification, alienation was an ontological quality of the human condition. Regardless of the historical circumstances, man had to see himself from the outside, and this is the source of alienation. In the center of consciousness, the split within the self was accompanied by feelings of, quote, anguish and, quote, anxiety. Although Hegel transcended the dualism of Descartes and Kant, a residual duality remained. Hyppolite insisted that Hegel's absolute subject was a, quote, unity of unity and difference. A, quote, unity of unity and difference, end quote. An unstable synthesis of the particular and the universal called the, quote, authentic individual, end quote, which incorporated alienation as an essential moment. Section C, the unhappy consciousness. With this vision of humanity burdened with alienation, Hyppolite was naturally led to exaggerate the stage of becoming that Hegel called the unhappy consciousness. Just as Kojeve found the master-slave relationship the pivotal shape of consciousness in the phenomenology of spirit, Hyppolite exalted the unhappy consciousness as the, quote, fundamental theme of the phenomenology, end quote. Emerging from the blind alleys and pitfalls of Stoicism and skepticism, the unhappy consciousness represented the moment when man finally recognized the absolute but experienced it as a place beyond humanity. In the most general terms, the unhappy consciousness was the dualist vision. Quote, consciousness of life is a separation of life itself, an opposing reflection, ... It is knowledge that the true is absent and finds itself rejected on the side of nothingness. End quote. Hyppolite. Hyppolite stretched the unhappy consciousness across the vast majority of the history of Western culture. The Jews were the, quote, unhappy people of history, end quote, because their absolute God, Yahweh, was an unattainable other. Similarly, the subjectivity of the Christian Middle Ages, as well as the romantic sensibility, suffered the unhappy consciousness, yearning for a beyond that forever escaped them. In an earlier pivotal book on Hegel, Jean Wall, a mystical existentialist, had already argued that the unhappy consciousness pervaded the whole history of man as the moment when the synthesis of any epoch broke down into a dualism. Using the unhappy consciousness in this way, Wall went on to make Hegel a Christian theologian, or a Kierkegaardian, who explained the human condition as the sad awareness of finitude over against the infinity of God. Where am I? Although he also saw the unhappy consciousness as prominent in the phenomenology of spirit, Hyppolite tried to wrest Hegel from the theologians by refusing to see him as a, quote, mystic. Wall's thesis would leave Hegel in the grip of Christian dualism, where the only point of contact between man and the absolute was a mystical union of souls. On the contrary, Hyppolite explicated the phenomenology of spirit as a statement of humanism, in which man incorporated the spirit of God as a human spirit, much in the manner of Feuerbach's Anthropologism. Man recognized God as a human projection, but, and here is where Hyppolite differed from Feuerbach, as a necessary projection, since man needed to separate man's self from himself in order to become himself. Hence, an element of transcendence remained as a residual source of man's self-recognition, but is no longer the Christian God. In fact, Hyppolite discerned in Feuerbach's atheistic reduction of God to man merely another evidence of the unhappy consciousness. Quote, but if Hegel appears to incline towards humanism, Hegel rejects the complete reduction of God to man. Hegel maintains always a certain necessary transcendence of man, the great sadness of man, a form of unhappy consciousness, is to be reduced to himself alone, to have absorbed the divine in himself, end quote. Hyppolite. Hyppolite concluded that Hegel took an equivocal position between mysticism and humanism. Hyppolite characterized Hegel's dilemma as the tension between a phenomenological and ontological philosophy. Was Hegel merely describing the transformation of consciousness in history, or was he reducing history to the development of being? Was he historicizing logic or imposing logic upon history? The communist theorist Roger Garaudy, who went on to become a Holocaust denier after converting to Islam, the communist theorist Roger Garaudy concluded that Hegel's mystifying idealism resulted from his attempt to account for the, quote, necessity of the bourgeois revolution, quote, of 1789, while at the same time, quote, justifying it as the achievement of history, end quote. For Hyppolite, however, this opposition between history and reason, or between phenomenology and logic, missed Hegel's achievement. The philosopher's, quote, absolute knowledge was itself a historically new epoch that went beyond the contradictions of the French Revolution. What Hegel achieved at the end of the phenomenology of spirit was at once logical and historical, the beginning of a new stage of consciousness that would unfold in time. Quote, according to one's temperament, Hegel might be criticized equally for having constructed a logomachy, or logomachy, Logomachy, in which every event of history is reduced to a play of logical opposites, or for having contaminated this logic or for having contaminated his logic with the accidents of history. But either approach implies a neglect of what is truly original in Hegel's work as one of the great attempts to relate the singular and the universal, which in ordinary consciousness is are juxtaposed without reconciliation. End quote. Hyppolite. Hyppolite stressed the unity of the contradiction, that absolute knowledge was both the development of reason in history and the first unfolding of the ultimate logical structure of being. New section, section D. Work and self-consciousness. As well as to the phenomenology of spirit, French interest in Hegel in the late 1940s turned to the early writings from the Bern, 1793 to 1796, Frankfurt, 1797 to 1800, and Jena, 1801 to 1807 periods. Of Hegel's varied concerns during these years, the French paid special attention to two: the idea of Christ as mediator, and the critique of the liberal notion of work. Once again, the French found in these ideas further examples of the dialectical relation of reason and history, as well as the ground of a new philosophical anthropology. Catholics, of course, were most interested in the meaning Hegel ascribed to Christ. In his early writings, Hegel returned to Lessing's notion of religion as the moral education of humanity. He defined Judaism through Abraham's rejection of the world and his elevation of God as the transcendental otherness of man. With Christ, however, God the Absolute appeared to the disciples as partly human. Christ mediated finite man and infinite God, and he did so in time. The Absolute appeared to Christians for the first time as human and as temporal. The notion of Christianity played a central role for Catholics. This notion of Christianity played a central role for Catholics, with personalist and existentialist bents, in rejecting the purely transcendent and atemporal concept of God, making possible some degree of reconciliation between these Catholics and Marxists. I believe this is part of a broader trend. I think there is like a broader trend in this period, and this is something you hear about in a lot of like the histories of Marxism, especially in the post-war period, of like a certain theological reception of Marx, particularly the 1844 manuscripts. Anyway, more important to us than Hegel's early concept of Christ was the discovery in his lecture notes of the Jena period of his criticism of the organization of work under capitalism. Hyppolite, for one, drew the attention of Marxists to Hegel's remarkable comprehension of the dehumanizing tendencies of a nascent industrial and market economy. Hegel had read the founding work of liberal political economy, Adam Smith's book Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, before writing the Phenomenology of Spirit. The result of this reading were evident in the notebooks of the period known as the Jenenser Real Philosophy. In them, Hegel sketched early versions of his system of logic of nature, and most significantly, of the phenomenology of consciousness. In the section on consciousness, Hegel spelled out an extended critique of Smith. Hegel focused on the distorting effects of bourgeois society, civil society in Smith, Bürgerliche Gesellschaft in Hegel, in its tendency to privatize consciousness. Quote, as citizens of this state, individuals are private persons who have as their purpose their own interests, ... end quote. Hegel. Or, I'm not sure actually if that's Hegel or... No, I think that's Hegel. Cited in a book by Hyppolite. Or cited, yeah, I think that's Hegel. Where am I? Acting in the marketplace and in the family only to augment his private interests. The bourgeois particularized his existence, downgrading the social nature of his role. Society then constituted itself beyond the individual, forcing his existence to become contingent. Society acted upon him as a, quote, natural necessity, a blind force giving his business affairs a, quote, abstract character. In capitalist society, work lost its intrinsic value and became machine-like. Quote, through the abstract character of his work, man becomes more mechanical, more indifferent, less spiritual, end quote. Hegel. Just as a side note, this is just a thought that I have kind of frequently, is like this character is like the Marxist characterization, and I think in Hegel characterization, or like just generally this characterization of the decline of work, to like this kind of like mechanized, routinized kind of work that's like devoid of any particular inputs of the direct producers into the qualities of their work, or the control of their work. I feel like the notion of like someone at this one point in time controlling their work is based upon like an artisan model, and I think that, I mean, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think like artisanal labor was a very limited segment of the overall labor, of the overall work that was done in, say, pre-capitalist societies. Um, I think that most of the work was pretty grueling, boring agricultural labor. Now, might have been benefits to that peasant condition, right? I understand that like peasants had like, they had cycles where they worked a lot and then didn't work very much and kind of had recreation. And then also they made a lot of their own things. So maybe there was some kind of um, less alienated feature of that, of like the self-subsistence of production, but kind of this idea of like, I don't know, the cobbler or something like that having control of his craft or something like that, um, as like a comparison, or like, and it's also, it can lead to like the idea, it's like, as a comparison, I don't think is like, has much, it should be kept in mind, I guess is what I'm saying. It should be kept in mind that this was like, I feel like that all, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm saying this, but it seems like artisanal work was very limited. Most of the work that was done was agriculture, and a lot of it was either like, a lot of it was not with very primitive technologies. Um, Also, the other thing that I think this problem with this kind of like a lot of the conceptions of alienation that are kind of based on this model is the idea that somehow within like a post-capitalist society, work would become like highly personalized or something, right? There's this idea of like, you know, part of the alien, sometimes there's like kind of like this flipping of like, alienation means like working on a product that is not like consumed by yourself, if that means like you're giving away, you're externalizing the product and not using it for your own particular benefit, but for the benefit of some other. You're alienating your product, right? And I think that this kind of can sometimes lead to the notion that like in a post-capitalist society, this would like somehow not be the case. And I think this is like this kind of idea of like, yeah, you'd be in direct control of your labor process and on the character of your product, and you'd consume the product. There's a very much like, I don't know, there's a very, I don't know, questionable way that this kind of thinking about pre-capitalist labor could be applied in a direction that might be, I hate using this word because it's overused, but like petit bourgeois, or like cooperativist, if that makes sense. I don't know, like like, I don't know, you're kind of like, it seems like work will remain for other, but in a different capacity, in any kind of conceivable socialism that doesn't have the pitfalls of market and state. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm just rambling on. Anyway, acting in the marketplace and in the family. Oh shit, no, where am I at? In capitalist society, work lost its intrinsic value and became machine-like. Quote, through the abstract character of his work, man became more mechanical, more indifferent, less spiritual, end quote. And again, I think that's Hegel, but I'm not sure. Hyppolite's discussion of Hegel's critique of Smith is worth quoting at some length because it depicts graphically the way the French saw Hegel as the source of a renewed Marxism. Quote, the individual, quote, can work more, end quote, but as Hegel says, quote, the value of his work begins to diminish, end quote. Nevertheless, he is pushed to lengthen his hours of work or to increase the intensity of his work in order to produce more, to be able to produce the means of subsistence. After a variable lapse of time, this progress is cancelled and the individual is thrown back to his previous level of life. Quote, labor is then a commodity that is worth less, end quote. Here, one sees how Hegel goes beyond Adam Smith, announcing the iron law of wages and in a sense anticipating Marx's analysis. But Hegel perceives all the consequences of the division of labor. Because of the abstract nature of labor, it becomes more and more mechanical, more and more absurd. Of course, the stick is replaced by the tool, and the tool yields to the machine, which is man's craft over nature, bending its blind forces to human purposes. It reveals the in itself of nature through the for itself of man. In his study of work and the machine, Hegel develops a new conception of finality and of theology in general. But man's cleverness with regard to nature has repercussions for the individual man. In practice, it transforms intelligent and integral labor into a stupefying and partial labor, quote, formal and inhuman, end quote. I'm assuming that's Hegel. The humanization of nature results in the dehumanization of the laborer. Oh, that's good. I like that quote. So I have to copy that down. Finally, the movement of production and distribution as a system leads to, quote, the restless search for machines and new markets without any limit, end quote. Hegel. We may say that as early as 1805, Hegel had envisaged the process of production for production's sake, of which Ricardo spoke and which Marx described, end quote. Jean Hyppolite. Although Marx had no knowledge of these manuscripts, they demonstrated to Hyppolite and the French an essential continuity of direction in Hegel's dialectic of consciousness and Marx's later social theory. Although Marx had no knowledge of these manuscripts, they demonstrated to Hyppolite and the... I already read that, sorry. Starting in the wrong spot. Hegel did more, however, that indicate the contradictions of the division of labor and their alienating effect on work. In these same manuscripts, Hegel formulated the outlines of something like Marx's concept of the proletariat. With the appearance of new, more mechanized industries, the individual worker totally lost control over the work process. Hegel perceived that the capitalist economy prevented the creation of free workers. Instead, it generated a new form of slavery. The outcome of capitalist industrialization was the condemnation of a whole, quote, class of men to factory and manufacturing work that was completely trivial, unhealthy, and without security, ending the need for skill and personal capacity, end quote. Hegel. Not only did the new society alienate labor, it increased the gap between the rich and the poor. Contrary to the expectations of Adam Smith and liberalism in general, the free enterprise economy did not end the inequities of feudal privilege and did not establish a society with the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Bourgeois society gave rise to a new contradiction, a new form of inequality. Quote, this inequality of wealth and poverty created the greatest rending of the social will, internal revolt and hatred. End quote. Hegel. Although Hegel here presented the capitalist world of the post-revolutionary epoch as oppressive and contradictory, Hegel did not always maintain this radical posture in his later works. Even in the Phenomenology of Spirit of 1807, where the critique of work in bourgeois society was somewhat muted, Hyppolite noted the change in Hegel's social theory only partly. Hyppolite did not take note of the conservative nature of Hegel's late work on politics, the philosophy of right. I think some people dispute the conservatism of the philosophy of right. I know Michael Heinrich does, but he's not a Hegel scholar, but I think he draws on Hegel scholars. What's his name? I couldn't remember his name. Andreas Arndt or something like that. He's like a big Hegel scholar in Germany who's like kind of like probably like a left Hegelian of some kind. Anyway, Hyppolite did take note of. Oh shit! I fucking misread that sentence. Hyppolite did take note of the conservative nature of Hegel's late work on politics, the philosophy of right, where hierarchical corporations were celebrated as true intermediaries between the individual and the state. Too often, Hyppolite reduced Hegel's social theory to that found in the Yin and Zur Realphilosophie, where Hegel, as in the following passage, was made to sound like a Marxist before Marx. Quote, "Society, is a communal effort, a transaction of each and all, the object itself, but in this object the individual becomes alien to himself. This alienation, which Hegel identifies with the objectification or the externalization of man through man's labor, is a new concept which, enables Hegel to raise the human problem in all its capacity," end quote. Yet this radical Hegel was just what was needed for the French to stimulate a rethinking of the Marxist dialectic. Yeah, I think, to my understanding, like Hegel's use of the word like alienation and like is mostly understood in this term as like externalization, like the expression of like human capacity in products in nature on matter other than themselves. That's how at least my limited Hegel knowledge tells me. And that's radically distinct from the concept of alienation in Marx. But that's just my there's a footnote here that says, "It has been reported that manuscripts of the philosophy of right have been uncovered showing that Hegel censored his own radical positions. This could end the argument over his conservatism." That's interesting. See the article in Der Spiegel, March 26, 1973. Very similar viewpoint. See Eric Weil, Hegel et l'État. So maybe that view has become more prominent. I mean, I think a lot of people who are like maybe I have a biased slew of people, but I think people such as like Terry Pinkard, maybe Stephen Holgate, I'm not sure, but I think like a lot of like I know at least Terry Pinkard, like the big intellectual biography of Hegel, definitely has this position that Hegel, I'm pretty sure at least, has a position that Hegel is not a conservative. But I'm not sure. Anyway, new section 4, Hegel, Marx, and Sartre. The study of the introduction of Hegel's phenomenology into France in the post-war years raises the curtain on the major themes of French social thought through the 1960s. Only the widespread influence of the phenomenology in redirecting the concerns of French intellectuals can explain, at the level of ideas themselves, the importance and interrelationship of Marxism and existentialism. Historically, both Marxism and existentialism were born in the heyday of Hegel's prominence in the 1840s. As a young man, Karl Marx, with his doctorate in philosophy from Berlin University, was a member of the Hegelian Philosophical Club. Traces of Marx's Hegelianism appeared most notably in two of his studies from the 1840s, both devoted to a critique of Hegel, one on the philosophy of right, the other on the phenomenology of spirit. Similarly, the first modern existentialist, Soren Kierkegaard, defined his own philosophical position through a study and criticism of Hegel. This connection is often forgotten because these traditions rose to prominence only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when Hegel's thought had, with few exceptions, faded into obscurity. I think there was a famous, it wasn't a Hegel lecture. I can't, because I think Hegel died in like 1830 or something like that, off the top of my head. But the person who replaced him at the University of Berlin, I think it was Schelling, was kind of brought in by the Prussian state as some kind of like conservative intellectual figure to replace Hegel. I'm not sure, but there is some famous like lecture or whatever where like very important people were. I think Soren Kierkegaard attended, as well as Friedrich Engels and Mikhail Bakunin. But I can't quite remember. Maybe that's not correct. But I feel like there's some important lecture that they all were present at, whether or not they knew each other. Engels definitely knew Bakunin, or would become to know Bakunin. I don't know if they knew Kierkegaard. Anyway. Similarly, the first modern existentialist, Soren Kierkegaard, defined his own... Where did I read that? Where did I stop reading? The common origins of both traditions were lost from sight as they appeared on the intellectual horizon from almost opposite directions. In post-war France, the two important commentators on the phenomenology, Kojeve and Hyppolite, were steeped in varying degrees in both Marxism and Existentialism and colored their presentations of Hegel with their own preconceptions. Kojeve had been swayed to Existentialism through Martin Heidegger's book Being and Time, published in 1927. Hyppolite came to it primarily through Sartre's book Being and Nothingness of 1943. Every page of their commentaries on the phenomenology was loaded with existentialist concepts like anxiety, human reality, Dasein, or et la. I'm not sure what that particular punctuation point or marking means. Like when when something has an arrow or like a upside down unfinished triangle on top of the letter. I'm not sure what that means in terms of pronunciation, but I think it's etre la, maybe, or et la. I'm not sure. Anyway, the situation becoming the project. Hyppolite gave as Hegel's definition of man the word-for-word description used by Sartre in Being and Nothingness. Quote, "Man is the being who is not what he is, and is what he is not." End quote. Kojeve was accused of existentializing Hegel, and Hyppolite explicitly posed, quote, "a close connection between Hegel and contemporary existentialism," end quote. Both Hyppolite and Kojeve treated the various stages of consciousness in the phenomenology of spirit as, quote, "forms of existing," end quote. In his outline of the phenomenology appended to his commentary, Kojeve labeled a long section, quote, "concrete existential attitudes," end quote. In fact, one of the difficulties in understanding both commentators rests on determining whether the connections between Hegel and existentialism emerged from studying Hegel, or whether the existentialism of the commentators distorted their understanding of Hegel. By the same token, Kojeve and Hyppolite had affinities with Marxism and discovered Marxist ideas in Hegel. Kojeve was rebuked for this, quote, error by Aimé Patry. Quote, M. Kojeve is, the first, to have attempted to constitute the intellectual ménage à trois of Hegel, Marx, and Heidegger, which has since that time been such a success, end quote. Aimé Patry. The well-known account of the master-slave relation by Kojeve, as we have seen, probably went beyond Hegel's intentions in depicting the revolutionary nature of the slave. For his part, Hyppolite devoted many articles to the careful definition of the relationship of Hegel and Marx, finally collected as Studies in Marx and Hegel. In this book, Hyppolite summarized in the following way the whole question of the Trinity: Hegel, Marx, and Existentialism. Quote, starting from the Christian teaching, which gathers humanity in the living God, Hegel had sketched a philosophy which in effect finally reduced nature, religion, and the state, respectively, to the philosophy of nature, the philosophy of religion, and the philosophy of right. Kierkegaard and Marx, each in his own way, showed the existential emptiness of this contemplative reduction. But where one went back upon philosophy to religion, to an existential concept of religious man, the other pushed the critique of religion on into the critique of the social foundations of religion and of philosophy itself, which Marx called a, quote, spoof of idealism, end quote. A, quote, spoof of idealism, end quote, end quote. Hyppolite. To clarify adequately even the main outlines of the interrelations between Hegel, Marx, and existentialism would require a separate volume. We'll present Marx and Sartre separately at first, preparing the ground for the subsequent dialogue, which was hostile in the beginning but ended in significant mutual influence. By the end of the period in 1968, Marxism and existentialism were approaching a synthetic, quote, existential Marxism, end quote. Thus, the central theme in my presentation of French and social thought since World War II was Hegel's Protean insight of the dialectic of reason and history. The Marxists focused on the transitory aspects of social institutions, on their collectively human source, and on the intellectual's position within history. The existentialists stressed the temporal nature of consciousness and reason, the subjective individual experience of being and time. Both, however, used Hegel to break through the hegemony of idealism. And that's the end of chapter 1 of the title is Existential Marxism in Postwar France, from Sartre to Althusser by Mark Poster. And chapter 1, again, was titled The Hegel Renaissance Towards a Philosophical Anthropology. And the sections were Hegel in France, Kojeve, From Master and Slave to Free Workers, Hyppolite, The Unhappy Consciousness, and Hegel, Marx, and Sartre. Thank you so much for listening.